they wish. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final workshop of our online workshop portion of the 2023 Community Workshop Series. I'm Katie Harris. I'm chair of the MLK Coalition's Workshop Committee. I'm a white female with short curly gray hair and purple glasses. I'm speaking from my house with a bookcase and Bolivian textiles behind me. This afternoon, you'll be participating in the 7th of 15 workshops. After today's workshop, we'll offer 8 workshops in person at Garfield High School on Monday morning before the annual rally and march. And tomorrow, we'll hold a virtual Young Leaders event where young people interpret Dr. King's legacy through discussion and performance. This event will be interpreted in Spanish, Somali, Amharic, Vietnamese, and Cantonese. You can learn about all of these events on our website. I'll put the link in the chat in just a minute. Before I introduce you to this afternoon's presenters, I want to mention a couple of logistics. This workshop uses a webinar format. When you put something in the chat, only the presenters and I will see it. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. Finally, if you'd like to use closed captioning, please look for the captioning button at the bottom of your screen. You may need to look for the 3 dots that say More if you click on them or hover over them in order to access captioning. In this workshop, we'll be highlighting the importance of anti-racist education in early childhood education. You'll be learning about the tenets and goals of anti-racist education practices and the state of education. You'll learn about how to establish more supportive and racially affirming education for Washington families. Now I'm going to turn the mic over to Renata Bryant. Renata, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Kate. So I'm going to share my screen so that folks can see the presentation. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Cool. Welcome. Thank you guys for taking this Saturday afternoon to participate in this workshop. My name is Renata Bryant. I'm the Community and Advocacy Specialist at the Imagine Institute, and today we're going to be talking about anti-racist practice in early childhood education, as well as the importance of anti-bias training. Briefly, our agenda, we're going to go a bit into the Imagine Institute and our role in securing quality and culturally affirming education or educational environments for kiddos. We're going to talk about the current state of education for BIPOC communities nationwide and in Washington. And we're going to go into anti-racist principles and practice and our Prepare for Care curriculum, wherein we center those principles. And we'll close out with a brief summary and talk about how people can get involved. So a little bit about the Imagine Institute. We were founded in 2016 as a result of collective bargaining agreement between Child Care Workers Union, SEIU 925, and the state of Washington. The Imagine Institute engages in a competency-based approach that enforces the core belief that child care providers' years of experience, community relationships, language, and cultural competencies make them uniquely qualified to deliver professional development, mentorship, and training to their peers. So here are our staple programs. The Imagine You program helps licensed providers helps people become licensed providers by partnering them with licensed and seasoned mentors to assist them in opening their own childcare program. The training program allows folks to access free training in the language of their choice. And it helps to strengthen their skills as childcare providers and maintain state training requirements for licensure. The technical assistance program provides stewardship in accessing grants, again, in the language of their choice, and making sure that providers are able to maintain both compliance and eligibility for state funding opportunities. Our shared services hub provides resources such as business supports and access to peer networks and technical training to help grow their businesses. And lastly, our subpool provides access to paid leave benefits and the ability to access state-approved substitutes in order to maintain stable childcare slots for families, especially those in childcare deserts. So these stats are not up to date, but this is from the fiscal year 2022. And this is the impact that Imagine Institute programming has in Washington State. So we've assisted in opening up over 400 childcare facilities. We've provided high quality instruction to over 2,000 childcare providers. And we've also provided training for over 1,500 licensed family childcare providers. When looking at these numbers, it's really important for us to highlight that in our Imagine You program, 90% of the Imagine You interns identify as a person of color, and 60% of those interns speak a language other than English. And we've also created over 900, I'm pretty sure that's over 900 childcare slots for subsidized families. That's a key point when we look at wage gaps and poverty rates between BIPOC communities and non-BIPOC communities. As we move forward through this presentation, hopefully the magnitude of these statements will hold more significance for you all. Spoiler alert, increasing the number of teachers of color has really great outcomes for students of color. So let's see. So going into why this matters. In this slide, I'm going to go over some basic information around how fundamental and important early childhood education is for children in terms of providing them with the essential building blocks and a sense of understanding the world. I'll be including a more comprehensive list of birth through 5 developmental milestones and highlights in the resource guide after this presentation. However, the benchmarks listed are directly influenced by what children see reflected in their learning environment. So, birth through 5, children have major cognitive developments, such as learning, thinking, problem solving, picking up and learning social and emotional cues. There's increased physical capabilities such as walking, dexterity, ability to mimic and achieve minor tasks independently. They develop a sense of awareness of themselves and others. They start to engage in storytelling and the ability to communicate and play with others, and word image association. So I'd like for folks to really think about how these developmental milestones might be impacted by your racial identity, or how you may develop a sense of awareness around race during this time. So looking at the state of education for BIPOC communities. All right, so now we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into the quality of education that BIPOC children experience and how a predominantly white education workforce reinforces disparities and educational outcomes, and is also reflective of discriminatory practices within the education systems. I think I need to forward this. I'm going to play this quick video.
You've probably heard that Seattle schools are struggling to address the achievement gap. In fact, a 2016 study showed that out of the 200 largest public school districts in the nation, Seattle had the 5th highest achievement gap between white and Black students. And in another study that tracked states' progress in closing that gap, Washington came in last, meaning the gap increased over 15 years. So what's happening here? Well, kids don't all begin school on a level playing field. In Seattle, there's a big disparity between students of different racial backgrounds, starting from the first day of school. You can see this in the latest measures of kindergarten readiness. Many things influence readiness: family education level, socioeconomic status, access to childcare. It's why in recent years, this issue has been renamed the opportunity gap. In Seattle public schools, by the time students reach third grade, this opportunity gap has become a 3.7 grade level gap between white and Black students. And this pattern continues through high school and beyond. So what's the solution? Experts suggest focusing on high quality, affordable early childhood education to tackle that gap before kids start school. Seattle is attempting to do just that with its preschool program, which launched in 2015 with 280 students and enrolled about 1,500 this year. Advocates say there is more to be done, as public kindergarten enrolls 3 times that many children.
Cool. All right, so some of the key factors creating this opportunity gap are the lack of recruitment and bias in hiring practices, the ongoing bias and discrimination in the assessment of BIPOC children, and of course, the impact that this implicit bias has on underperformance for how we assess BIPOC children. I'm not sure if folks are aware of an incident that happened 2 years ago at View Ridge Elementary School in Washington, where it was found that an 8-year-old Black boy had been repeatedly held in a cage with a padlock as a form of discipline. It shouldn't really come as a surprise to anyone that the only teacher who intervened was also the only Black teacher at that school. I'm using this example to try to stress the fact that, yes, we absolutely must continue and increase our efforts in creating a standard around implicit bias training and culturally affirming teaching practices to try to close that opportunity gap. However, we also need educators who are reflective of the communities being served. I'm sure that many of us have participated in DEI groups in their workplaces, and we know that just because you attend a few trainings does not necessarily mean that your values around equity and inclusion are embedded in that practice. Let's see. Just play that. So the next few slides are meant to illustrate the connection between representation of BIPOC educators and access to comprehensive and quality education for children. Since Brown versus the Board of Education, racial disparities have continued to exist in our communities. They're a profound manifestation of the impact of both cultural and institutionalized racism in this country. In assessing the achievement gaps, we were able to see the continuation of these policies despite the strides being made towards inclusion and equity. So specifically so this is regarding Seattle or student populations and workforce populations nationwide, but in early childhood education and preschool, Black preschool students make up about 18% of the total preschool population, but over half of the preschool expulsions. So however, in education environments with a diverse workforce, a child of color who has a teacher of color in preschool through 5th grade is 39% more likely to persist through high school. So this is a direct impact on kiddos' ability to thrive and maintain themselves K through 12. So also, I'd like for folks to keep in mind that one of the primary goals of early childhood education and for providers is to build and support healthy relationships with children and their families and their understanding of the world. So in this, ECE providers are the first interaction that children have with institutions, namely the education system. The current state of these institutions and their impact on communities is comparable to those of public health, housing, and other systems that are fundamental for folks to have a sense of upward mobility and a sense of community, a sense of security in their communities. So, and it's in these statistics that we see the beginnings of what might inform a sense of institutional distrust. Institutional distrust being directly informed by individual and collective experiences with institutions. In this slide, we see one of the many ramifications of having a lack of representation and inequity in our education system. Some key highlights being the proportion of white educators to BIPOC and how that compares to the student population. In the third, fourth, and fifth columns, please note the disproportionate degrees to which, in an environment with very little diversity, BIPOC students are far more likely to experience expulsions for behavioral problems than they are to go into a classroom with an educator who looks like them. Again, studies have shown that BIPOC providers are less likely to lean into punitive and disciplinary measures, such as expulsions with BIPOC children, and they're far more inclined to note their strengths and acknowledge academic achievements. So this has a direct impact in that opportunity gap video that we just watched. And I think it's really important to consider how this impacts not only children's view of themselves, but also their value and how that impacts their relationship to institutions as a whole, which we're going to go into on the next slide. If anyone has any questions, please do let me know. So I'd like for folks to take a second to look at this Pew Research Center survey that done, investigating the degree of value that Black Americans feel in their sense of culture and racial identity. As we can see in this study, 54% of Black Americans, I believe the actual statistic is 62. So 62% of Black Americans say their racial and cultural identity is important for them and reflective of how they experience the world. So if we hold that as true, if your racial and cultural identity is extremely important in how you evaluate yourself and your self-worth, what might the impact be when you're experiencing exclusion and discriminatory behavior from those who are entrusted with educating you? What message does it convey when, as early as preschool, you do not see yourself reflected in stories or positive images? Again, thinking back on how pivotal those early years are in child development and developing an understanding of yourself, others, word, image associations, etc. For many of us, having a sense of fictive kinship in the figures we see in media, books, television, movies, can bring a sense of affirmation in seeing those who look like us in positions of power and authority. This idea of fictive kinship is extremely important when we consider being able to provide preschool children with role models who will offer them some framework to make sense of the world. One clear message that you might receive through lack of representation is that your particular experience is not relevant, it's not meaningful, and that you and those who look like you are not valued enough to be in important positions in these systems and institutions which are considered vital for economic and social mobility. And I'd like for folks to take a minute to ponder what the impact might be when you feel that you are disproportionately disciplined or negatively impacted because of your racial identity, and you don't see those who look like you in powerful positions, especially considering this statistic here, where having a sense of connection to your racial identity is deemed extremely important in Black communities. So these factors, such as lack of diversity among educators, high expulsion rates, the absence of culturally affirming teaching practices, and implicit bias, work in collusion in creating three primary impacts for early childhood education for BIPOC children. That would be in setting the stage for the opportunity gap for young ones, hindering economic mobility. As we know, having access to quality education is fundamental in ensuring K-12 readiness, and also critical skill sets needed to navigate the world. And in my opinion, in combination, these things are detrimental to the relationships that communities have with institutions. And we're going to go into anti-racist principles and practice a bit here. Oh, sorry. So these are the four primary themes of anti-racist principles. The top two quadrants here really focus on the deeply personal work that must be done in order to decolonize our minds and understand understanding of the world. The lower two, sorry, one second. The lower two slides address the fact that at the end of the day, education and school settings are tools of socialization, and we must prioritize promoting resilience and a healthy sense of one's racial identity. However, before doing that, we have to tackle these two and address our internalized belief and develop a more inclusive and equitable view of history. Going into anti-racist practices, I think it's that a lot of folks underestimate is that these teachings and principles are for everyone if we use it as an inclusive framework. It should be of no surprise to anyone at this point in the presentation that even if you come from a marginalized identity, there's still work to do, because all you've been doing throughout preschool and K through 12 is internalizing all of these negative messages about yourself, right? And so if you're raised and molded through an educational system, which may not include you and how it recognizes history and culture, then your attitudes regarding your identity are shaped by those interactions. And so this is where we see internalized anti-Blackness, internalized and negative ideas on your identity and those who may look like you. And in these anti-racist practices, it really does allow us to develop a critical lens for assessing what we are being told, how we are perceiving others, including how we may be perpetuating or continuing negative and problematic teachings within our community. And so it's in this that I really appreciate the aspect of decolonizing history and understanding that we all have a role in the process to different extents. We absolutely cannot talk about decolonization without recognizing the fact that its origins are in attempting to atone or make right on the centuries of degradation and forced assimilation suffered by Native American communities. Decolonization for me asked us, what does it look like to recognize and challenge power structures that continue to subjugate us all to various extents? It's also about getting rid of certain colonial, i.e. racist mentalities that we have internalized. And it asks us to recognize that there's nuance in our experiences and the ways that we might continue colonialization. And it's an important question we should continuously be asking ourselves, more so, especially so for early childhood educators. So again, remembering so what does all this mean? In short, preschool is a prime intervention point for us to try to minimize the impacts of racism in our education system and set the stage for economic mobility in our communities. Numerous studies have shown that starting as early as preschool, students who start behind academically are more likely to stay behind, and this gap increases over time. A study done in 2013 found that students who attended preschool were more likely to stay in school and get a higher education than their peers. And, excuse me, as we know, people with a higher education often have more economic stability and job opportunities in the future. Okay. So on this slide, we're going to go a bit into the nuance around BIPOC educators in the early childhood education workforce. It's important to note that 60% of childcare-oriented small businesses are owned by BIPOC individuals. This includes spaces like family home childcares. Compared this to industry and nationwide surveys, wherein 29% of small businesses are owned and operated by BIPOC communities. Some reasonings behind this may be existing wage, education, and opportunity gaps that reinforce the likelihood of BIPOC educators being really dominant in this field. So in K through 12, there are more stringent requirements for higher learning, i.e. you have to have a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree. And as we discussed earlier, there might be more cemented bias in their hiring practices. And so As a whole, we have a field which is not only fundamental for communities across racial and ethnic boundaries, but professionally accessible to many, especially women with children who have that lived experience. Some other acknowledgements I want for folks to consider in this slide is that small and locally owned businesses are known to be fundamental in maintaining thriving, cohesive, and self-sustaining economies, wherein we can provide for ourselves and recirculate throughout our community. And this is why it's so important that we incorporate a multi-pronged approach when it comes to racial equity. It's not just in providing training to white providers who might be in the process of unpacking their own internalized racism, or not racism, and trying to figure out what it looks like to create more equitable education systems, but we also have to get people who look like us in the room. And on the labor side of things, having this well-rounded approach to anti-racism, we are able to secure and safeguard economic opportunities for our communities from K through 12 well into adulthood. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. And I'm gonna take it over to Amelia, who's gonna talk about our Prepare for Care curriculum, where we really center anti-racist practices in theory.
All right, hello, can you guys all hear me? All right, so my name is Amelia. I am the Senior Director of Equity and Evaluation at the Imagine Institute. I joined Imagine in 2018 specifically to run this program. It was originally funded by Best Starts for Kids. Many of you guys might know BSK. And we specifically used our BSK funding to get this program off the ground. And since then, we've been able to expand this program outside of King County to Washington State to other states. And to tell you a little bit about the program, you know, there's not really a lot of anti-racist education, even in K through 12. And in early childhood education, it was virtually non-existent. And so we really wanted to be able to develop something specifically for early childhood education, which is when 90% of a child's neurological development happens, to make sure that early child care providers have the resources and the skill base to prepare children for the K through 12 school system. So it's really an approach to, you know, addressing the effects of racism and trauma by making sure that child care providers themselves are aware of the systemic effects of racism and trauma. The curriculum was developed by consultants called Learning Solutions, and then it's been expanded upon by additional curriculum developers. One of the things we really wanted to focus on when developing this curriculum is to move away from, you know, the typical diversity curriculum or the inclusion curriculum that is kind of typical of like required trainings that is, you know, kind of typical of most organizations where like, oh, take a diversity training, learn about a specific culture, you know, and to go away from that kind of mock approach to training and to go into specifically anti-racist 60 hours of real work that providers will take. These providers that took the course, you know, completed an application, they were vetted, they actually, you know, stated that they were committed to changing the way that they operated with children. They committed to actually doing homework assignments. They committed to doing this class over a course of 10 months. And they committed to actually a philosophy of anti-racism and changing the way not only that they work, but to anti-racism themselves. So it was really a pilot of of sorts when we started the program. And since then, we've been able to spread not only to the state, but to other states since then. One of the things that, we talk a bit about is, there's a lot of trauma-informed care that people talk about, but people don't often talk about racism itself being a form of trauma that children experience, and the impact of racism that, how it impacts children and how it internalized racism can impact a child's development. And so we wanted to make sure that providers are aware, especially white providers that are caring for Black children, are aware of the impact of internalized racism. And they know about it, they know how to talk about it, which can be very awkward for white providers and Black providers themselves. They tend to shy away from it because they don't have the vocabulary and it's very uncomfortable. So we wanted to make sure that people know how to have those conversations, and those conversations are impossible to have if you don't have the vocabulary from them and you're uncomfortable with those conversations. So creating dialogue is important, and you can't have those conversations if you don't have the vocabulary and you're uncomfortable in those situations. So creating an opportunity for dialogue was really important for us. So I'm going to go over a little bit of the original content of the program. It was originally designed for 10 modules. Since then, we've expanded. But the original content for the Prepare program, first module specifically focused on the importance of the healing relationship. And the healing relationship is embedded throughout all of the modules of the program. The relationship between the provider and the child is central. None of this can happen without a strong developmental relationship. And so we focus a lot of the program around building a strong relationship with the child. Secondly, we talk a lot about identifying trauma and vicarious trauma, both for the provider and for the child. How to identify trauma, how to talk about trauma with how to identify it in the child, how to talk about trauma with the family as well, how to support the child if the child is experiencing trauma. And then we move into more of the anti-racist content, and we focus on that for quite a while. So we talk a bit about the invention of whiteness, the purpose of the invention of whiteness, the importance of that social construct and the political motivation behind that invention, why it was invented, and what it has resulted in. We talk a lot about inclusion and decolonization. So, and we eventually just called it decolonization in the future. So this talks a lot about internalized racism. We talk a lot about how you internalize a lot of these, you end up internalizing a lot of what has been taught to you. And, we use a lot of personal examples. I've taught the curriculum themselves. So, we use our own personal histories when we're talking about this curriculum. We talk about our own experiences of race, our own experiences of colorism, and how we have internalized that and how that has impacted our childhood. And how it is, moved throughout the world today and how it impacts children. Module 5, we talk about racism and development. So a lot of times people think that we don't need to talk to children about race because children are innocent and we live in a colorblind society and children are colorblind. But children are aware of race at a very, very early age. They develop their racial identity at a very early age, and they're aware of not only their race, but how they're aware of a racial pecking order. So they are aware of how their race is seen according to other races as well. And they're aware of that through media images, through the news, through all sorts of things. So pretending not to see it and not talking to children about it when they indicate things to you is not necessarily helpful. Module 6, we talk about the psychological impacts of racism. So we go into a lot of not only the psychological impacts of racism on Black children, but on white children as well. So we use examples like the doll test. Many of you might have seen videos like that. And also this impacts white children as well, and the ideas of racial superiority and where that comes from and how that starts to develop. How the media and other sorts of books that we read and stories that we read perpetuates those ideas, and how we can help children develop positive racial identity, regardless of whether they're children of color or white children. Module 7 is family dynamics, and this is all about how you can have positive relationships with families. A lot of it has to do with identifying the ways family operates. So we talk about different family styles and communication styles and how to navigate those. Module 8 is my favorite. So that's promoting resilience. That is mostly about how you can build resilience in children. Module 9, we don't do as much, and that's collaborative approaches. That's not only engaging with family, but community as well to build resilience in children. And then module 10 was just a review session, so that we went through all of the different modules of prepare, we talked about it, we interacted, and then we closed out the program. So it's 10 months, 6 hours for each module. The participants did it as a group. So we had an English cohort, we had a Spanish cohort, we had a Somali cohort. They did these classes together as a group for an entire 10 months of training. Hold on. Over time, what we have heard from our participants was, okay, well, that was great. We want to continue having these conversations. What else you got? And we were like, that's it. There's no more content. And they were like, well, where else can we go? And we're like, that's it. There's no more. And so we realized very quickly that we needed to continue developing additional curriculum around these contents. And people really wanted more gender development curriculum. And so we started really outreaching to other curriculum developers to help us develop new content. And so some of the newer curriculum that we have really centers around body autonomy and consent, and that's teaching children about boundaries, how to identify boundaries. And this is really important, especially for young girls as they're growing up, so that they start to develop healthy boundaries. In the future, this is going to have really strong implications, especially for young girls. We added on to understanding and disrupting biases as well. So that's, and then add on to some conversations we had in our original prepared content. We also added on to our family dynamics module into family systems. This is some deeper conversations, especially around families that are engaged in different systems such as CPS, because navigating those systems can be very, very hard for families, and it's very hard to build trust with families that are engaged with systems. Providers can have a difficult time building relationships with families that don't have trust. And because both of your interest is in supporting the child, it's going to be really important to make sure that you understand those dynamics and both of you can work together to support children. And then our last module of this kind of pilot new curriculum was an evaluation session. One of the things we really liked about this curriculum was we had homework assignments. At the time, we were using Google Classroom because, you know, it's free, and it gave people the ability to do homework in different ways. So they could type up their homework, or they could do like a video submission, or they could just record themselves saying what they did. Since then, we've moved on to different platforms, but it was really cool to see what people tried when they were implementing a different assignment. And of course, we, you know, because these classes were paid, you know, we paid people to, you know, attend the class. We wouldn't pay them unless they attended the class and they did the homework assignment. So we're not just paying you to listen to the content, like actually do something in your child care. That is, you know, how you get the incentive for the work. And so I'm just going to give you, like, this is a sample homework assignment that we had for our decolonization module. And so people had the option of trying one or two different things. And so in module 4, we talked a lot about dominant culture norms. And we had a list of different dominant culture norms. And we talked about what, each dominant culture norm was. And so for this homework assignment, people could pick a dominant culture norm that they wanted to dismantle in their childcare environment. And they would select that one, talk about how they were going to dismantle this culture norm, talk about the changes that they made, what was surprising, what was affirming, what was most challenging, how did this impact the children in your childcare, and then they would just put it in Google Classroom. This is what happened when I tried this. I mean, and sometimes there was a big change, sometimes there was no change, sometimes it was dramatic. The other option that they had for this assignment was we had this video called Danger of a Single Story. And some of you might have seen this video. And they would think about a child in their childcare environment where they had this like really narrow-minded viewpoint, or this child is just really difficult, or they just don't listen. And they would talk to other supportive adults in that child's life. And listen for multiple stories of that child. And then think about what was the single story that I had about that child, and what did I learn after speaking to other family members about that child, and how did this affect my attitude? How did this affect the way that I interacted with this child? And then they would put that assignment into Google Classroom. And this assignment, I think it was one of my favorite ones to kind of read, because what people learned after speaking to other adults in their child's life was really fundamental. People had no idea what sorts of weights these children were dealing with, what sorts of traumas and experiences that these children were carrying with them. And this impacted the reasons why children were behaving the way that they were behaving. It completely changed the way providers were interacting with them. So that's kind of like an example of things that people did as a result of the program. I'll pass it back to Renata.
Thank you.
Hello.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Amelia. So I wanted to take a minute. I realized that I might have bulldozed through the first half of the presentation. And so if there's any slide or information people would want to review right now, let me know. If not, I wanted to close out the presentation and looking at some of these action items that folks can engage in. We have a message from Patty Bailey, who is the Director of Early Childhood Education at SEIU 925. And she has a message on some political advocacy opportunities coming up with a QR code that you can scan on your phone. And then also, if you wanted to receive more information about the Imagine You program, or if you are interested in becoming a licensed family childcare provider, you're welcome to go to our website and look at those opportunities. And I'm going to play this message and then we can get into the Q&A.
SEIU is a union of about 2 million diverse members in healthcare, the public sector, and property services who believe in and fight for our vision for a just society, where all workers are valued and all people respected, no matter where they come from or where they are, where all families and communities can thrive, and where we leave a better and more equitable world for generations to come. I am proud to be the first African-American early learning director for licensed family childcare providers and family friends and neighbors in the state of Washington. SEIU is proud of our commitment to join together with members to fight for our future, just like we won better wages, safer places to work, and civil rights in our past. We believe that no matter the size of the communities we live in, we know how to come together when times are tough. Family childcare providers serve families in communities we live in. We support families with safe and healthy environments where children are cared for while their parents or guardians go to work. Today, some providers are living under a homeowner association known as HOA, are experiencing threats to close their business. These threats of closure are harmful to the provider's ability to provide a much needed public service that helps to keep families working. A closure threatens the provider's family's financial stability and would displace many families depending on a safe place for their children to grow and thrive. Our licensed family child care providers are currently in an action to gather signatures to support legislatures to vote yes on House Bill 1199 that would exempt family child care home owner association rules like adult family day homes are currently. SEIU stands proudly in solidarity to see justice where justice is due. You can help us today by signing our petition electronically or on paper. Thank you for your time and attention. Have a great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. weekend celebration.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing right now. And are there any, I see that there's, so there is a question here. Would you give an example of a dominant culture norm and how it can be challenged? I feel like a dominant culture norm that, and Amelia, feel free to hop in, that I feel like more folks are having conversation around is dominant culture and also like white supremacist culture, right? And undoing this need for perfectionism because it doesn't leave any room for error. And we're humans, we're complex organic creatures and things are gonna happen. And in society and also in education systems, sometimes we create these really rigid learning frameworks for kiddos where it's either all or nothing, and it doesn't really help them move along and like grow and learn how to fail and succeed and also figure out what success means to them and their individualized capacity. And so I think that for me, that's something that in my everyday life and also in different systems, I consider what perfectionism looks like and how it's being upheld and how it doesn't allow you to show grace for yourself and others. And so I would say that's a way that it could be challenged, is telling people, especially young kids who take everything to heart, that like, it's okay, right? You can try again. You can come back from this. Instead of being so, I guess, and I also feel like that's like a binary framework, that like you either win or you lose. It's either perfect or nothing. And that's just not a way for human beings to thrive and learn and live. Does that answer your question, Kate? You can do like a thumbs up.
And if I can chime in too, because I'm just going by memory of the assignments. And I think the ones that providers picked most often was the sense of urgency. And this is just because, you know, providers tend to operate on these specific schedules. You know, this is lunchtime, this is nap time, this is this time. And children they can't always just do things on this time. And they need to follow these schedules because it helps things flow well, but at the same time, children often need time to decompress, or they need the ability to have some flexibility. And so that one, dismantling that in the childcare environment was helpful for children, not necessarily for the providers, but it was helpful for the children. Providing more flexibility in that norm was something that I saw providers picking as something that they wanted to dismantle.
Are there any other questions that folks have? Or are there any slides that people would like to have us go back and review and dig into more, since we have some time left? If not, I'm happy to pass it back to Katie.
Well, this was really great and incredibly informative. And I really appreciate this. We haven't had this topic before for a workshop, and it getting people started off in a good direction in life is just so foundational. But I'm so glad we were able to present this. I wanted to let people know about what's coming up. Tomorrow we have the Young Leaders event where young people will be interpreting Dr. King's legacy through performance and discussion. And that will be interpreted into Somali, Amharic, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Cantonese. Then Monday we have 8 in-person, highly interactive workshops at Garfield High, followed by the rally and march. And I put in the chat the links to the information on the MLK website about those events. And then also I put in the chat a link to the evaluation form for this workshop. So it's very important for us to get your feedback on the workshops, because that really informs how we produce the workshops in the future and what topics we choose. So with that, we are ready to close. We will follow up with an email, which will have resources from this workshop in a couple of days. So thank you so much for attending, and thank you so much to our presenters. And that concludes our presentation. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. Enjoy your weekend, everyone.